Lars Nielsen. I'm the General Manager of Global Certification Forum. We have this week started here a series of workshops in India, working with the mobile industry locally here to see what certification options there will be of mobile devices. Our background is we was established back in 1999 as a certification forum set up by operators and manufacturers, and has since then expanded more or less to all over the globe, doing certification of mobile devices where the operators, manufacturers come with their input to the requirements, what are the features which are important. Our overall objective is to ensure there's no interoperability issues between the mobile phones and the networks.
Now on some of the key criteria that we need to be looking at. And we've had some different viewpoints that have been shared. So, as we kind of go through this exercise, we really need to understand, where do we draw the boundaries of what we're trying to achieve, rather than keeping it open-ended. If we can have some areas of agreement, then at least we can move forward on those. And then, of course, the other areas that maybe necessarily we don't have an agreement on, we can still keep to make sure that maybe we can get to a point where there can be an agreement. So the first objective is to get a better understanding of what technical areas need to be covered for device certification in India. And this relates to two major subtopics. One is applicability with the current scope of testing within GCF. And I'll cover a little bit about what we're covering in GCF from a scoping perspective. And then any delta testing that's required for India market or for regional considerations. And on the first point, I want to highlight that, again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So if something's been already established, if there's a way to adopt it, then maybe that may be the best approach. And then if there's anything additional that needs to be coming in, then under the delta testing, then we should capture that and bring that into the GCF. The second point is, how do we determine the feasibility in the medium in which this testing should occur? So the different areas of testing, conformance testing, which is lab-based, field testing, interoperability testing, and then we talked about sort of end user experience, so we can look at user acceptance testing. Where do we want to cover these test cases, and just basically understand some of the key considerations needed to make this program viable, cost-effective, and allow regional players to be competitive in a fast time-to-market environment. And I know some of those variables may be playing against each other, but we need to kind of figure out, is there a happy medium that we can achieve? So in terms of maintaining the optimal balance between some of the scope, the time to market, and the cost for executing, we need to make sure that we get the right balance between these three so that we don't sacrifice quality, right? And GCF's testing today as it stands is very modular. So as I mentioned, it's based on device features. So if the feature is supported on the product, there's a test case or a set of test cases that can be executed. And I don't have specifics, obviously, in terms of or visibility into, I knew we threw some numbers around earlier, which sometimes may be a bit dangerous. Like we say, it costs $100,000 to run GCF certification. But it really depends on what are you exactly testing. Is it $100,000 to cover a full-fledged device that supports 2G, 3G, 4G, all of VoLTE, all of the different applications, and so you're running all of these different modules? How much does it cost to actually execute sort of a bare bones device that's maybe just a 2G device only or a 3G device only, right? What if it's only LTE only? And if it's an LTE only device, then is it still that amount, right? Because now you don't need to execute any of the 2G or 3G test cases. So we need to kind of keep that in mind that the test cases within the GCF right now are covering very specific functionalities that, if it's supported by the device, may be applicable. Second of all, within the GCF, there are programs in place to optimize any of those different areas of testing, and that's currently ongoing. So I think the operators and manufacturers of the GCF realize that as new technologies get integrated, the scope of testing does get increased. So there's constantly an approach to make sure that all the test cases are optimized. And yes, maybe a lot of the optimization is happening on some of the more mature legacy technologies as opposed to some of the newer areas. But over time, as those newer areas become more mature, this kind of approach will filter down and take place downstream as well. One example is, for example, when you're doing environmental testing, there's approaches to look at and say, well, maybe the tests should occur for temperature and voltage only in the extreme conditions and not necessarily in the medium conditions. So those are the types of discussions that are already happening that, once they're in place, can be leveraged right away. So when we look at the three different layers, the radio access, service enablement, application, I've just listed some at a high level, in a very simplistic manner, what is currently covered. And this doesn't cover the full scope of GCF, obviously, but it gives a sort of broad view of the different areas. And the question becomes is, would these be applicable? And if it's applicable, then how can we leverage it? Can we leverage it in its entirety? Or if not, then why not? And how should we look at ensuring that we can make it applicable and while at the same time maintaining the quality? And then are there others that we're not looking at that may need to be supported here? So a good example is, we talked earlier about GPS, or if we look at NAVIC, if there's a potential new opportunity to have the solution for India being supported on devices, and that needs to be tested, then that's a unique requirement for this market that may necessarily not currently be available elsewhere. So maybe we look at those and make sure that gets captured, but gets captured in the overall program. So if the device is supporting that solution, then it should be tested even if it's coming to India or not, right? So when we look at an India market endorsement, and again, I'm using some of these terms a bit lightly in the sense that just to engage in this discussion, whether we call it a market endorsement, I think in MENA the term that was being used was profile, right, Lars? The term profile was being used, right? But really at the end of the day, it's achieving the same thing. It's taking into account very specific needs of a certain market and capturing that, right? So at the radio layer, I don't know how much of a difference there is between different regions. These are standard-based technologies. If we reference them, then I think they can be taken as is. On the service enablement layer, yes, maybe depending on the type of services offered by the operator, we can determine which one we can leverage from GCF, which ones are unique to India that maybe at some point in time we can introduce into the GCF as well. And at the application layer, what additional testing is needed for the India market? So this market endorsement can be investigated to capture some of the specific testing requirements for India based on GCF's overall scheme. So what we really need to know, speaking of bands, is identify the bands that are required for India that are not already included in GCF. If it's not included in GCF, we can bring those in. If it is included, then maybe we can leverage that as is. Identify any additional areas of testing from the current set of GCF core tests, obviously based on feedback from this group. Ultimately, it would be good if we could work with partners from this region to define work items for those test areas and submit them into GCF and capture them in the overall testing scheme. And then reference these delta requirements in the, as I mentioned, the India market endorsement. So that way, it's very clear to manufacturers, if you're supplying the product into India, what's very specifically is required for that particular product will be captured in this document. Determine which testing environment should these delta requirements be tested in. And as I mentioned, do we do it in the field? Do we do it in a conformance environment? Do we do it in the IOP? Or based on user acceptance testing? And basically facilitate the development of those corresponding test solutions. So when we talk about testing environment, and I know we talked a little bit about this before, we can leverage some of the existing test solutions. I think from a radio perspective, maybe little to no development is really required. And I don't know, I need probably feedback from you guys to say this is correct or not. I know the key concern was, at least before lunch, was that even though these tests are all available, for it to be made available in this market, there's a cost involved, and maybe that might be difficult to sustain. But if we can work, with test manufacturers to see if there's economic viability for those existing tests, and if there's new tests that need to be created, work with them to kind of build those in, then that might be a worthwhile exercise. And then from a field testing perspective, operators should investigate having their networks becoming field trial qualified for Indian market specific services. That's probably the best way to get interoperability testing done to ensure that some of the issues that we talked about earlier are not occurring. And of course, I didn't mention performance testing here, but we could add performance testing components to make sure things like drop calls are tested to make sure that that's not occurring as well. And similar for interoperability and user acceptance testing, we can establish methodologies for any of those applications or clients that need to be tested in a live environment. So some key consideration, let's leverage as much as possible from GCF what is already developed rather than reinvent the wheel. I think we all agree we don't want to develop something new for an area that's already existing. I know we talked exactly about this earlier and before lunch, but our initial thought was, cherry picking test cases for execution from existing set of tests are not recommended, given that it creates holes in the quality criteria. And this was some feedback that we got internally at GCF. And again, I heard it today as well, in some of my offline conversations. So we have to be very careful how if we do decide to reduce tests, then what is the impact of those reductions? And where do you draw the line? For example, if we say, okay, for a low-end device, there has to be some minimum testing, low-end testing done. Where do you draw the line to say what is a low-end device, what is a high-end device? What happens in the border conditions where, there's two devices, one falls under the low-end criteria, one falls just outside of it, yet they support the same features, right? And who makes those decisions? But we could look at development of tiered certification practices, which is a sort of basic test, reduced test, full test plans for a given technology, specifically or for areas such as child and variant models, or platforms, for example, so that if a platform has already undergone the full test, then any device that's based on that platform does not necessarily need to go through the full test again. So we can investigate things like that, but do it in a way where we have some traceability between the final product and as well as the components or the platform that it's leveraging to show that that those testings has been done. And I know in some cases, for example, operators do in other regions chipset certification, so they'll certify different chipsets. Those chipsets are actually platforms; they're actually locked. So at the end of the day, if those chipsets are being leveraged, they are basically there's no modification happening. So the core tests that have been executed on those platforms can be reused, right? So that can reduce some cost as well. And again, input from this group will be taken into the GCF market, India Market Task Force meeting that will take place. I think we're scheduling it for the last week of August, so that at least we can share the, what's the needs and wants from this group and the requirements from this group to see, how we can come up with some viable options.